Hi there. Thanks, Yasmina, for setting us all up, and welcome to everyone. I guess there are pros and cons of this kind of environment, and that I can't see you and you can't see me, but I'll give you a heads up that I'm gesticulating with my hands a lot when I talk. One of the pros, of course, is the size and geographic diversity of the group. So let me add my appreciation to everyone who's calling in from places where we wouldn't get to do this so easily. It's really cool that we can have this experience, people from all over the world together, and hope you guys have a good back channel and can throw your own additional thoughts and suggestions so that you guys can have a good separate conversation. And definitely I want to get the questions towards the end that are going to come up inevitably, which is great. So with that, I will move forward. And just to mention here about the book Interviewing Users specifically, that URL that's at the bottom there, there's a tab that's called Resources on that URL, and there you will find things like sample documents, interview guides, screeners, debrief worksheets, as well as other presentations and other bits of material that kind of expand on what we don't have time to cover here and kind of support the book and this talk in general. So if you want more, and especially those artifacts, go there and check them out. They're for you to use and build upon. And Yasmina already said a little bit about my organization, where I'm coming from professionally. Just to unpack, I think it's always good to start with this phrase that I use to talk about what we do, because I think it frames where I'm coming from in terms of interviewing people, in terms of using research in a design or other business process. And the phrase that we use is to help companies discover and act on new insights about their customers and themselves. And here's an image. This is where we're based in sunny/foggy Pacifica, California, if you want to locate me geographically as we talk around the planet here. So, I was in this discussion on Twitter even the last 48 hours about ethnography, this word that is often used to describe contextual research where we make sense of what people are doing and we explore. And that word is so loaded with misinterpretations, and it can be an intimidating word, it can be an exclusive word. And for my own work, I have tried to separate myself from that word because it is just so loaded and it doesn't always describe what we intend to communicate. And so the phrase I'm using here is to discover and act. People often talk about research, say, well, we got some report, but it didn't tell us what to do. And I think as someone whose business it is to interview users, I want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that leads to action. And so I'm just trying to claim that right up front. I use the verb discover because it's generic enough, and I'll come up with that again in a moment or two. I'm not committing to a methodology. There's an approach and a philosophy, and that's, I think, what we'll talk about today as well. There are best practices, but we're always iterating and improving them. And our goal is to discover something and do something where we can act on it. The second part of this blurb here says that we learn about our clients' customers, but also our clients themselves. And that's just to say that there's no, research with customers doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are companies that will produce reports that, indicate trends or indicate patterns, but the kind of work that we're talking about doing here is very much in the context of where are you starting from? What is the problem? What do you think? What do you believe? What have you tried? What's unspoken inside your own culture? Why do you want to know this? What do you think you're going to do with it? All those things are there. So we're not in the business of let's just go learn something in a vacuum. It's very much where are we starting from and how do we understand something new or different in a way that builds on what the starting point is, whether that starting point is a question or an assumption or a goal. And so just always want to anchor the activity of research and its output in who we as a team are that are doing that exploration. So that's my high-level hand-wavy stuff. Well, that's not all of it. You're going to get more of it as I tend to kind of go up to the clouds and then go back into the details. But let's move forward from there. just talk. It's an extension of what I was saying here a little bit, but just setting up the problem and then incorporating research practices to address it. So to build further on what I was saying here about the terminology, not only is ethnography a term that's loaded, but as you go to any organization, whether it's internal or vendors, you see a lot of terminology being used to describe generally the research process. And I haven't included the silly ones in here where people take words like, well, I won't pick on anybody specific, but I'm sure you've all seen something where, well, the first part of the word is this process and the second part of the word is that process, and then you squish them together and you get a really ugly word that therefore describes your own unique thing that you do and you can trademark. And that approach to methodology doesn't really appeal to me, and it doesn't help anyone understand and learn and kind of embrace a method. It really makes it a kind of proprietary thing that's exclusive. And so, this list of terms, I pulled some of these from some websites over the years, and I think I found a website where it was kind of like ordering like a Chinese lunch menu where you pick something from column A and something from column B. And there are points of differentiation for methods, of course, but from kind of a jargon point of view, I think it's really distracting from where I want to be and where I want us to be having this conversation. And so here's kind of my response. Whatever. I don't care a lot about the difference between a site visit and a contextual depth interview. And when someone approaches me and says, "Oh, we want to do CI is the shorthand for contextual inquiry," and I have to kind of probe them to find out what they think that means and how that's going to work and what the factors are, because that's actually a term. I think that may be a trademark term, and it refers to somebody in their book and their approach. And I just want to make sure that everyone understands what it is we're agreeing to do, and that means often just kind of unpacking the language a little bit or skipping it, entirely if you can. So here's how I think about the approach in general, and regardless of what labels you put on it, here's kind of what I'm advocating for. We examine people in their own context, and I've highlighted in their own context because I think that's a really, really important piece. I sometimes vary from it because there are always constraints in how we, have to work, but the best stuff comes from the context of the people that are doing it, whether that's physically their office space or their home or their kitchen or their car or their commute or their factory, shop, whatever it is. Going to where they are is really key, and I'll hit that a little bit. We examine people, so that's another generic verb. I don't know what we're going to do. Are we going to observe them? Are we going to interview them? Are we going to show them things, have them go through tasks? Whatever it is, it's some kind of examination. So from examine, we can really build out a whole bunch of specific details of that approach. And when we do this examination, we're looking at many things, but here's two key ones to think about. I think this is really important here as well. What are they doing? So how many, how often, where are they stuck? What's the kind of analytical, observational factoids that you need to make sense of their process or their expectations or their behavior. But also, what does it mean? What are the ways that people construct values, construct stories, create relationships? These are often the hidden things. You get the meaning by simply asking about the doing, but it's important to remember that that's crucial and to listen to it and to collect it and to make sense of it. I think people might typically just stop with the doing and not really dive into the meaning, but that's crucial. Especially think about this next step here, infer, or if you want, interpret, synthesize. We're not just scooping stuff up and reporting it. This is not requirements gathering where the stated requirements are presented to us and we collate them. This is something much messier and much more creative and exciting. We're making sense of things that don't really make sense on the surface. That's the work of doing, that's why we do this research, is to feed us the opportunity to squish a bunch of stuff together in a rigorous way. I'm not going to get into that in a lot of detail today, but to go through that process in order to have something new to say. And then the third is probably obvious to many of us, but is always worth restating. We do something with this. We apply it to a problem, a business problem, a design problem, a service problem, a communication problem. We tell a new story by going further than what we started out with. And we have different kinds of solutions. We may be trying to create an X or fix a Q, but the level of insight we bring by doing this can point to other kinds of solutions. If you really want to accomplish this goal, the real problem is really over here. And so, yes, we can do the X and the Q that we started out to do, but there's additional opportunities here to really support addressing the deeper need and the bigger opportunity for us. So that's my kind of overview. I am waving my hands now, literally, of the approach and why I'd rather kind of anchor us in this definition than in kind of disputing over what the difference are between various methodological handles. And there's a lot of different discussions about what methods, and it goes back to that granularity of methodology. What methods do you use when you're at this point of the development process? And you've seen lots of graphics, I think, that show here's what a web design development process looks like, and here's what this and this kind of product looks like, and therefore we deploy these kinds of methods at these things and try to kind of create a unified field theory. I think this is really hard. And maybe some big thinkers can kind of do it, but I don't find it very applicable because there's always exceptions. And so I have just kind of simplified and genericized this a little bit here to think about how a thing gets made. What do we think we're going to do? Let's look for the opportunity. Let's refine and prototype. Let's throw it out there into the world, and then let's iterate it. And we use interviewing at all sorts of different points along the process. The very left is let's just take a fresh look at people and understand what's going on and point towards what we could make or do. As we go down the process, we are creating concepts, wireframes, storyboards, prototypes, interactive prototypes, all sorts of varying fidelity there. And at any one of those points, we can interview people. And here we are looking through the lens of the solution as opposed to at the very left where we're just taking a wide open exploration. What could we do? Here we're saying we think we're going to do is something, and it's something like this. And here what, of course, we're exposing is our hypothesis about the problem and our hypothesis about the solution. And this is great. We can talk about both the problem and the solution together. This is different, I think, than testing. I think I'll come up against this later a little bit, but here we're not testing. Here we're kind of provoking. We're exploring, and we're testing ourselves. And we're not testing a solution, but we're testing our own hypotheses. And I'll say more later about what artifacts we create in order to do that. And then, of course, we iterate. Things are, 2.0 and 12.0. They've been around 20 years. We have history. We have legacy in the marketplace. We have an existing user base. And so we want to improve and iterate. And so we are looking at the history and what's already going on out there in order to gather insights that are going to direct where we're going to go with it. So I want to introduce two terms here, a little jargony, but I'm willing to call these anything you want, but just to show a contrast here between the business question, and the next slide we'll talk about the research question. These are things that are different from each other. So here, let me show you where I'm starting with this. The backdrop of these two slides is an actual client slide. I've redacted it so that there's no confidentiality that's being broken here, but it's from an entertainment technology company. And here's basically some trends that they were looking at that they thought might impact what they could do, what they should do. I love how one of the trends I identified is China with an exclamation mark, as if that kind of sums it up. But, you can imagine that's kind of a shorthand for a lot of things that are going on. So the business question is, based on these inputs, these things that are happening here, these trends, what questions do we as a business want to ask? So I made these up. These aren't real here, these call-outs. But questions like, what new products and services can we offer to help our partners increase their social network stickiness? What entertainment activities should we support to tap into the middle class that's growing in China? So those are things that the business is now thinking, what are we going to do? Those are different than, here I'll go to the research question. The research question is then, what motivations, successes, frustrations, both current and prospective customers that are using these different social media sites? Or what are changes in middle-class family life in China, and what are the digital technologies, the analog technologies that they're embracing? So hopefully you see the difference here. The business question says, what do we as a business want to do? What's going to be different for us in terms of what we're going to offer and how we're going to make money or survive? And the research question is, what things do we need to understand in order to support that? And so here in my linear deck format, I'm showing it as kind of this hierarchy, right, where we've got the business question, the research question, and, an imaginary third slide I won't show is, what are the research methods that we would use to answer this research question to support this business question? Well, the real world is never this clean. I am approached by people with a business question, and part of the conversation I have with, developing an approach is to figure out the research question. I'm also approached by people who bring me the research question. We want to learn about what's changing for customers that are using mobile devices while they commute. And then in order to do a good job of answering that research question, I have to surface the business question. And they may not know what it is. They may not have ever articulated it. It's not like these things exist. They have to be facilitated. Often what happens, too, is that they both evolve. Even though we commit to a research method and we have a timeline and we're doing these things, all of these things are kind of forming. And so we might get a better understanding as we move through this project at what the business question really is. So again, I'm presenting this kind of idealized hierarchical thing. It is more evolutionary, but ideally as you move through it, you want to have all these different pieces and you want them to be tightly coupled. So let me move on here. And a lot of times the research question, even the business question, it's not a very good business question, but the default is what are the pain points? I've been asked this a lot by people. Can you tell us, for people that are doing such and such an activity, what are the pain points that they have? And I'm going to rant a little bit about pain points. It's kind of it's an approach to thinking that I'm not so keen on. We need to understand why those pain points exist. So here's a silly example, but look at this picture on the right here. Imagine we went and did all this research with people and we saw that they had drawers that were overflowing with obsolete, discarded technology products. And this was a real problem for people. If we kind of take this as a pain point, then what we decide we're going to do is make bigger drawers for people so they have more storage for all their discarded tech. And that's a silly example, but it's that kind of lens that's very limited. The real problem there, of course, is understanding why does technology obsolete? What's our expectation from it? How are people buying it? What's the life cycle? How do things trickle down? What can be done about to kind of change this? What does that really mean for people in terms of their own senses of consumption or staying current? So that's the usage versus the meaning that I talked about before. Understanding why are we here? That's really what we need to get to be able to do anything about. Otherwise, you just end up making bigger drawers for people and not really addressing the problem. The other example here is paint. Here's a paint can, and it's just it's a product that's not sort of fully realized, but we're kind of tolerant of it. And you can see a pain point there. It's covered in drips. The opener is something that, at least where I live, you get that opener from the paint store. The can is not self-opening. You have to get that little opener. And then we got these aftermarket sort of Tupperware lids that are meant to prevent drips. You can see how well that worked. You can fix those pain points, and I think Dutch Boy is a paint company that did that. but there's something else going on there. I don't claim to know what it is, but this is a more complicated systemic problem in the supply chain, in the user chain, in terms of our own expectations. Solving the pain point doesn't solve the larger problem in many, many cases. And so just to be cautious about using pain points as your lens. And I'm not done ranting about this. Let me keep going here a little bit. The other risk when you talk about pain points is that just because you think it's painful doesn't mean that it is so terrible for people. And there's a great word, satisficing, which many people know that word, but if it's new to you, I want you to just grab that word and hold on to it. It's like satisfy and suffice. It's economist Herbert Simon came up with this word in '56, and it really means we tolerate things that are good enough, not great. And so for all our discussions, especially in the design community, they talk a lot about, just incredible delight. We have these really powerful words for what we want to achieve with design, but the fact is that people are really tolerant of things that are good enough. And in fact, when the effort to adopt and implement a stupendous solution exceeds the pain, it's just not going to happen. And here's a gap, as people that make things, especially, I'm sorry engineers, I'm sorry designers, but when you see those things, they make you crazy, and you want to fix them and have the world be a certain way, but that's not necessarily what people care about. And this example on the left is from Fieldwork, and you probably have these things maybe where you're sitting right now. This was a few years ago, so the technology is different. But there's a fax machine sitting on top of the monitor. The fax machine is basically held in place by the tension in the cable that goes to the telephone jack. It should go someplace else. It shouldn't be just kind of precariously dangling there. And we know what the solution is, right? It's going to a store like Target and spending $1.29 on a cable that's 18 inches longer, so it could just rest on the desk. That woman that we interviewed was going through she had an infant. She had recently been separated from her husband. He burst into the home during the interview and kind of was very angry and a little threatening. We were there to talk about printing, and everything we talked about printing came back to her child, trying to raise the kid, the affair her husband had, like all the things that were important to her. She was never going to go spend $1.29 to replace that cable. It was never going to happen. This was good enough. The pain of replacing that cable, even though it seems simple to us, was too much. And so for us to go off and think we're going to solve these problems without really understanding where people are coming from is misleading, and just a risk. And then here, kind of a thought exercise. Here's a blog called There I Fixed It. It's kind of an LOL users thing, and I'm not happy about that. I want us to be a little more immersed in empathy when we think about these things. So here's a curtain. They've nailed the curtain into the wall to kind of hold it closed. And, yeah, we get the point, and that's funny, and that's totally fair. But I feel like there's a good thought exercise here to say, well, when would that be a good solution? When is that a good thing that the person who's the user has done to solve their problem? And try to understand their approach of doing it, not just sort of take a pain point from our approach. Oh, here's Microsoft. People maybe remember this campaign from Windows 7 a few years ago. I asked for it to use less memory. Now it uses less memory. And this is sort of an approach to, I mentioned requirements gathering here, as if requirements were simply gathered by direct input. This is the ad agency not really acknowledging the work that Microsoft does with a lot of ethnographers and anthropologists and other kinds of contextual work. Here they're just saying that, hey, customers are out there saying, I'd like you to reduce the memory footprint, and Microsoft says, oh, great idea, we never thought of that. Let us get our engineers to work. It's a really misleading and sort of dangerous, I think, philosophy that they're putting forward here about what it means to be user-centered. And the things that people have, we do more in what we make than simply collect pain points and address them. So just to keep in mind, we're doing something much more nuanced and complicated. Just quickly on methodology here, it's not a this method versus that method. It can really be a yes and approach. Here's an example where we did a extensive online survey with a large sample size with different demography here to get at different age and gender issues, I think that's what that was about. And you can tell how old this was. We looked at what the distribution was of different music applications on people's computers. So Windows Media Player was top, which is kind of funny, but it was a while ago. So that gives you a certain amount of information. And then we went and did contextual work, and we talked to people who were using these different programs, and most of them could not play a song for us. They would say, show us some of your music. Oh, let me see. Click, click, click. Nope. Okay. Click, click, click. Oh, no. Oh, okay. And the people with iTunes had all their music labeled, categorized. It was all very controlled. And so, the survey tells us one set of things that can drive the strategy, but the in-home interviews that we did told us something else. And you want to put all those things together to get a richer picture. It's not about this versus that. It's about, triangulating across multiple methods. So getting into some of the mechanics here, who do we include? Who do we recruit? Who do we have as participants? And this, I think, is hopefully a big idea you can take away. Who we learn from is not have to be who we design for. And so the default approach, and this kind of comes from market research, typical market research, is you go after the customer. But think about all the other people you can learn from, people that use your competitor's product, people that used to be in this category but aren't anymore, people that teach others, people that should be in the category. We did this once with people that should be using an in-home streaming device for music but didn't have one, didn't know about it, or whatever that was. People that will be our customers in the future, people that used our product and stopped doing it entirely. All those things are ways to, if you create a sample that kind of cuts across this a little bit, it lets you see things you couldn't see. The cliche is whoever discovered water, it wasn't fish. So if you talk to everybody that's coming from a certain perspective, there's factors that you're just not going to be shown that can be really defining. And so talking to people that you wouldn't make a product for, that you wouldn't sell to, that isn't your customer, can help you understand what your customer would never think to say because they're not in that situation. So you're giving yourself the chance to see something you couldn't see. That's the point here. You can think about the system of the types of users that you want to talk to. So they talk about sometimes in technology products, chooser versus the user. There are influencers. There are people that are downstream that don't use the thing but are affected by what the thing is. And this is a painful part of a lot of projects. And my example with Tom Cruise there is about a project we did with a global sporting goods apparel company who spent a month debating who their customer was before we could go out there in the field and do anything. And they would say they would say this in one sentence as if it wasn't a contradiction, which shows you how crazy-making they were. Our typical customer is a 16-year-old high school lettered athlete, and our website, which is what we were working on, is visited by women 28 to 36. And those didn't seem to be contradictions, and so we had to work a lot through some organizational politics to even agree on who should be in the study. So this was not a great experience, but it obviously is really revealing. So the struggles that you have over who the sample should be, you need to leave time for that because it can be really, really heated, and yet you're really getting to some of the big issues internally about who are we designing for. The things that you're going to learn about trying to identify who these people are and trying to find them are revealing to what that real problem is. I said before that the business problem gets kind of unpacked as you move. Well, this is a piece of that. Even just working through your recruiting can be a big piece of that. So before we go out in the field, we need to have a plan about what we're going to do. That's the interview guide. That's the field guide. There is a sample of that on the resources page I referenced at the beginning. It's a plan. What's going to happen, what activities, what questions, what logistics, what things you want to remember to say. I think the second bullet is really important here. There's questions we want answers to, and there's questions we want to ask. So that's the part of the art of conducting research, of planning research, is, to do an interview, you don't necessarily ask literally what you want to know. Otherwise, we would do a survey. So to have a conversation, to be open-ended, to kind of figure out ways to move people through things maybe they haven't thought about before by presenting analogies, by looking at different kinds of behaviors. You want to set them up to answer those questions for you without having to ask those questions. So that planning is a big transformation activity. When there's different folks going out, you want to make sure that everyone has seen and bought into the field guide. If you have stakeholders, you want to let them look at the field guide so they can see kind of I call it the platonic ideal. No interview ever goes like this, but based on what you know without ever having done one, this is what you think would happen. And you want to let someone else in your team say, oh, we're not asking about how they integrate with Salesforce. Oh, okay, I didn't know that was an issue. Now that we know it's an issue, let's find a way to include that in the conversation. And maybe all this is obvious. I kind of hope this is obvious, but I'll tell you, I've worked with other agencies. I had an experience where I was, it almost sounds like a kidnapping. I was taken in a car, and without really knowing what was going on, I thought we were doing kind of a planning session. After lunch, they took me in a car and dropped me at somebody's house and said, we'll pick you up in 2 hours. The person's name is Joe. Go interview them. We barely had a business question or a research question. We certainly didn't have methodology or a field guide, and the expectation was that I would wing it. And so I did. I'm pretty good at kind of winging it. But I came back and I said, okay, well, we're going to have 3 or 4 teams. Let's align on this. And we never did. So, it's kind of the story ends on kind of a sad note. I guess the good note is, like, none of us today are ever going to do that. We're going to have something. So it doesn't have to be huge, and I'll show you some examples. Think about these kind of 4 chunks. Some warm-up, some introduction. We talk about the timing. We talk about our objectives. We get their background. The main body is, where you really are going to dive into the topics that you know that you want to talk about, whether that's integrating with Salesforce or how you learn about features or, what your setup is. That's really the big chunk of it. There's a piece towards the end where we can ask these questions, these projection questions, these dream questions. These are audacious questions you don't really think you have permission to ask. But towards the end, you have a big, good dynamic, and you can start to ask people, what do you think it's going to be like in 5 years, or how will your children prepare breakfast for their children when they're grown up? We're not taking these answers as facts. We're just trying to have a more broad conversation and hear kind of what's richer in people's minds than simply what they do. And then we wrap up. We look at what do they want to ask us. If there's something we're kind of holding off on revealing, like what company we're from or something, we can talk about it then. If we tell them when the incentive is coming, whatever the logistics are. So if you want to just be really minimalistic with your field guide, it could be this. It could be just 5 bullet points. Here's the things I want to make sure to talk about. And as a field researcher, you can throw in the warm-up and throw in the background and throw in the logistics and so on. But even this would have been so much better. I didn't even have this I never had this the whole project with, where I was dropped at that house. We never really nailed this down, and I think it would have been so much more valuable if we had done that. I tend to write something a lot more detailed, and so this is just part 1. The full version's on that site. So I'm doing silly things like saying, 1 minute, 14 minutes. I want them to add up to the total time, because I don't want to have somebody review this and say, well, this adds up to 96 minutes and you only have 90 minutes. So I just try to take care of that by making the math go. It's just meant to show kind of relative weight, and as the interview proceeds, I can kind of check where I am on timing. So these different sections are kind of helpful to break it up that way. And then here's kind of a personal style thing, is how many probes do you say? You say, how often have you done something? Did you find it difficult? Did you find it easy? Why or why not? You can kind of keep adding parenthetical probes to this until it becomes kind of silly and becomes too wordy and too long. So it's just a personal style thing, I think, in the writing. You want to give the people that are reviewing this a sense of what the dialogue is going to look like, but it's not an algorithm that can run the interview without you. It's just meant to set you up to be successful when you do it. I'm going to skip through these a little bit quickly here in some of these next ones. You can do lots of other methods, and this really, you can include not just questions, but ask people to demonstrate something, ask someone to role play, make notes about what observations you should take. So the guide is not just your questions, it's richer than that. It kind of documents what else you should do. Participatory design is asking people how to solve a problem, and it doesn't mean that we implement their solution. It's giving people the chance to talk to us in a way that is easier for them. So talking about a solution. When someone says, I want it to have a handle, you don't say, I'm going to go off and to put a handle on it. You understand they're looking for a way to move it. So that might be make it modular, put it in the cloud, change the form factor, change the weight. But you're giving them the chance to talk to you about a solution as opposed to talking to you about their needs. That's just a different approach, and it sometimes may be more helpful for them to be able to talk that way. And I mentioned this before about sort of showing solutions. Testing versus exploring. Think about creating solutions to show that are not solutions that you would build, but are provocations. So you're never going to make this teeny tiny cell phone for lots of reasons of manufacturability and ear canal damage and so on. But as you start to show a range of sizes and form factors, you start to let people talk to you about what the solution could be, or even about what the problem space is, in a way that they couldn't. So think about not just pulling the artifact out of your design process and taking it out in the field, but choosing very specifically the fidelity, the features to show, the cartoon-like nature, the exaggerated aspects, in order to make the research more provocative. Very few people think to do this. This is, I think, hopefully a new thing. I think this is one of your takeaways. Just, I'm going to go through some examples here. Here's mock-ups we made of a newsletter. And we had a bunch of different designs. They were relatively high fidelity, although on the back of these, they used Greek text. Lorem ipsum was what was written on the back of them. And I think it was this woman here picked it up, and she said, oh, it's great that you used a second language. That's really a good idea. So her interpretation of our intent, it didn't match. That was kind of a good humility lesson, I think, for me. You can create working prototypes. This was a DVD projector on the bottom. That's just their big screen on the right. When we use this to create an experience that someone could go through, it wasn't the final product, but they could have an experience and then kind of talk about that experience. Just quickly on this page here, we can get people to do things before we go. We can get them to collect things, to narrate their process, to document, to take pictures, to fill out forms, to send us one of something every day. We can bring things to show them. I think we already talked about this. We can do exercises. So there's a lot of different kinds of things that we can do. And I'll tell you, for me, I'm always making up new ones and hearing other ones that people are doing and kind of evolving those. So really, as you evolve in your own practices, to start creating libraries of these and not being afraid to mash up or make up every time you go out. The core may still be the interview, but you're adding other pieces. Here's one that we made up. I'm not even sure what to call this. We call it a casual card sword. It's not a formal card sword in any kind of way. We're doing things like we created, this was about, I think, different kinds of online reviews. And so we created a bunch of cards. You can see how crappy they are from this photograph. They're just 8.5 by 11, regular paper. We cut it out. It's not even square. It just was a visual thing. So rather than talking, the person could move things around with their hands and create groupings, and we could, fill out other ones and so on. It was not a it's not a huge part of that study, but it was a really nice warm-up, a nice piece that you can do your own thing with. Just a reminder that when we're in the field, we're also looking at culture. We're also looking at, elements that reveal what the rules are in a society. In a society or a group, that could be teen moms in a suburb. That could be tech workers inside a certain organization. Whatever that is, there's a culture there, and there are hidden rules that people don't even necessarily articulate that drive what people do and what people don't do. Here's an example of a culture. This is an ad. It doesn't say what it's an ad for. It shows 3 heavy-set men wearing football jerseys eating the world's largest submarine sandwich. And it says, "Bring it on." And, I always ask people, what's this an ad for? And people say, oh, football, indigestion, Subway sandwiches. It's actually an ad for a toilet. And, hopefully you're kind of going, ugh, to yourself right now. That's kind of gross. It's surprising. That's what advertising is supposed to do, of course, is kind of get our attention. We don't talk about toilets in terms of what they do, what they really do. We talk about them in terms of cleanliness and so on, but this was a toilet that's prepared to deal with what happens when big guys eat a lot. Now that's gross, sure, but I not to just talk about toilets, but the point here is that there's a norm. The norm is we don't talk about that, and we certainly don't consider that element of toilets, and we don't put that in advertising. It's just not. It's not what we're used to seeing. It's not to judge it as right or wrong. It's just to say, here's a norm, and here's advertising doing its job when it steps over those norms. So you want to look for things that symbolize those norms. They reveal barriers. They reveal times when people will or won't do something new that you're asking them to do. And so that's why we go into the context, not just to be with the people, but to see their environments. Getting to their environments takes us through culture that may be unfamiliar to us. Here's a simple worksheet. There's, I think you can print this off from that resource tab. Take photos. Photos are easy to take. I've been doing this long enough that we used to use still, traditional film photography. And, now you can take as many pictures as you want, and it's free. Don't start snapping until it's kind of comfortable, until you've reached that point with somebody. But you'll see things in the photos that you won't remember happening. So they're great to go back and look at. Just quickly on this page, you need to record either audio or video what happens. You cannot take notes that are sufficient to capture all the detail. Your notes are, will have errors. There'll be ambiguity. You need that recording. If you want to take notes because it helps you process, that works for a lot of people. That's fine. Don't sacrifice your connection with the person, and always have the definitive recording be that magnetic media, that audio or video recording. So I'm going to scoot ahead and talk about the interview itself and give you some best practices here. I might just skip a couple slides here. 4 principles to think about. Check your worldview at the door. Embrace how other people see the world. Build rapport, and listen. Let me talk through each of these. So check your worldview at the door. Let go of what you think the world is, their world. This is not your world, it's their world. So you can do a brain dump at the beginning of the project and say, here's all the things we think we might see. It's not about being right. It's not about negotiating. It's just about dumping it. By dumping it, you're more free to hear it anew when you go out to talk to somebody on a project level. In the individual interview, you can kind of have these transitional rituals, and it's kind of like putting your keys in when you come, for men at least, when you come in the house at the end of the day. I just worked with a client that brings a bell. This is someone who's into meditation. It was a really great example. They actually brought one of these bells out, and they rang it. Before they walked in, they said, let's just listen to the bell, and they kind of rang it. And so that was a way to distinguish what happens before the interview to what happens after the interview. It's a way to help you set aside the business stuff, the meeting you came from, and just get you in this mode of like, we're going to learn about Paul. That's what we're here to do. So now you're ready to embrace how other people see the world, and I chose that verb embrace very specifically. It's, I'm gesticulating again. I'm reaching out with my arms to kind of take in their world. I'm not passively waiting for it to come to me. So that's why we go out to see people. I think at the bottom here this is a hard one. Ask questions that you think you know the answers to. So think about asking, when are your taxes due? This is a hard question to ask if you think you know the answer. And sometimes we worry about our own credibility in being able to ask something. Well, what's your problem? Don't you know that? But often if you ask what their experience is, you might hear something separate. So, getting yourself in the mode where you can not rely on your own knowledge, but ask and really just do that kind of embracing. The third piece here is about rapport. Just enough social graces. Too much chit-chat, and it's not clear what's happening. Not enough chit-chat, and it's kind of rude. Early on in my career, we interviewed someone who was just a little uncomfortable. We walked in, they offered us a glass of water. No, we want us to do the interview. And they never really lightened up. And about 30 minutes in, they said, would you like a glass of water? And we kind of looked at each other. We said, sure. She brought us the glass of water, and then she was comfortable in her role as host, and the whole thing really opened up. It was sort of, it's obvious now, but at the time I didn't really get. It was a long time ago. I didn't really get how important this was. This varies by personal style, but when you talk about yourself, I think people who are naive assume, I'll just say something about myself. I also like watching the television show Lost. You can just be enthusiastic about what they like and listen and engage without having to tell them that it's something about you. If you don't know when you tell them something about you, when it'll help them get unstuck. I had this happen just a few months ago. I talked to someone who was worked as a case manager and then kind of a complicated people with addiction. My girlfriend is a case manager for people with psychiatric hospitalizations. And when I heard it, I'm like, I wanted to say, my girlfriend does this. And I just held off on it because it wasn't really relevant. And then at one point, the woman says, we have this kind of dark humor in our field because what we do, blah, 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 blah. And I was able to say, yes, my girlfriend does similar work, and she also has those kinds of jokes. And then the woman said, okay, well, so you understand. And so I was just helping her over a hump. She was uncertain, and I could reassure her by revealing something. But otherwise, it wasn't relevant. And the last bullet here on this page, this graphic kind of suggests what happens. You'll see this happen in a lot of interviews. They go question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, and you're moving through your field guide really quickly, and you're like, what are we going to do? And then at some point, it's question, story. And it's a great moment. I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know how to get there. I can't give you any kind of advice except be aware that at some point you'll realize you're getting stories, and that's kind of when you've established your rapport. That might be 2 minutes. That might be an hour and 45 minutes. I don't know. But just to kind of be patient and look for that moment. We do a lot of listening when we interview, and the listening that we do, a lot of it is by what we say. So think about following up, using something they've said in the question. Earlier you told us about this, and I want to ask another question. All that is really great for people. We just don't get listened that way. This is very hard. We're not trying to be in the conversation ourselves. We're trying to make it all about them. We're trying to use words to signal our transitions and say, okay, well, that's great. I want to move on to something else now. If you watch kind of bad media interviews, Barbara Walters, for example, she just goes from one question to the next. But we want to create those links and continually remind the person that we've heard what they're saying, we're engaged in the conversation, we're thinking about what their experience is. Your body language says a lot. The one on the left says yes, even though it's a little cut off there. That's good body language. That's not so good body language. And so that not only tells the person what your engagement with them is, it also tells yourself. And there's some increasing amounts of research. Malcolm Gladwell wrote about this in Blink. You see this all the time in a bunch of different fields. Where we put our body tells kind of our mind and our emotions how to feel and how to behave. So Gladwell wrote about those people that were moving their facial muscles, and when they were to figure out muscle groups, and when they made sad faces, they felt sad. And it's this interesting idea that we can kind of induce a state through our body. So sit like you're listening, and it will help you to listen. Okay, here's the slide here's a takeaway. This is very difficult. It sounds silly, but it's very difficult. If you can improve on this, your interviewing will go up significantly. Often when let's say you want to talk to somebody about what they had for breakfast, here's how the question often comes out. What did you have for breakfast today? Did you have toast or juice or... So what I did was I put some suggestions of the answer in the question. And that means the person has to say, no, I didn't have any of those things. I had salmon left over. And you think it's not a big deal. They can kind of just tell you what the answer is, even if it's not what you suggested. But there's this power dynamic, and they talk about pleasing the interviewer. The more times you tell them implicitly what you want their answer to be, the harder it gets for them to actually give you a direct answer, and you start to influence them. So the question you want to ask is, what did you have for breakfast? And the reason you do this, and I do it too, the reason we hold on is because we're nervous. It's nervous to be silent. We don't know what that person's going to do, and so we think, oh, I'm going to help them answer. You can help them just by giving them space. The other piece I had there was that right? That's kind of the verbal ... I'm trying to hold on to my talking as long as possible by making a noise that goes so that I can just wait until they actually are going to answer me. But really you need to give them a little bit of space. Sometimes people get caught up in their question, and I've watched this happen. The person starts to answer. You can see it in the muscles around their eyes. They start to get ready to answer. So you can even stop asking your question. You can ask less of a question. So just be silent. Give your brain something to do. Saying, let there be silence is the thing that you can do. People speak in paragraphs, so when someone starts to tell you about their breakfast, if you move on to the next question as soon as there's silence, they actually haven't finished telling you the whole thing. So just wait, just nod, just look, let them kind of keep going. This is a story here about reflecting back people's language, and I interviewed someone a few years ago about their home entertainment system, and they kept describing TiVo, and my client was with me, and he's not someone that would really – he's a really sweet man, but just not sensitive to this level of nuance. And so when I asked another question, I asked about TiVo, even though that's not how it's pronounced. And my client later on asked a question, and he called it TiVo. And this gentleman and his family was very house-proud, very kind of, in front of his family announcing kind of these things he'd been successful with. And when he was implicitly corrected, now my client didn't mean to correct him. He just never, when he heard TiVo, he translated TiVo, and he kind of went forward with that. That obviously changed the dynamic in the room pretty significantly. So just for you to remember to reflect back how people talk, hear their language and adopt it and use it, and think about what that means as kind of your philosophy with your relationship with them. This is about them being the expert, and so the language is kind of a symptom of that. If you bring this principle in, then you can be really the language thing I think will follow. Here's the way to ruin an interview. Start fixing things for them. Let the participant start asking you questions. Is there a way that I can find video tutorials? If you say yes, just go over here, and then the interview is over. You can never get back to learning about them. This is where you use the researcher's question. Well, what would you like that to be? Where would you expect to find that? What kind of purpose would that serve? Just ask them questions and reflect back. If you have to tell them about a feature because that feature is important to them, not because it's important to what kind of adoption you're trying to drive, but because it's important to what they could benefit from, just tell them at the end. You have time at the end to do that. But really keep that in mind. Here's kind of a thing that happens here. Each thing that you ask produces some responses, and then the more you let them go, the more things that there are to talk about. And you got to choose what's your next question. And you maybe have 10 or 12 candidates of things to follow up on. And my recommendation here is at the bottom, really. There's a bunch of options, but really thinking about the emotional cues. And we had someone a few months ago, we interviewed them. I was coaching another researcher, and I was watching him, and he asked the guy about filing taxes, and the guy described his process. And then he says, then I deliver the forms, and then I have a panic attack. And my guy just said, and where do you store those forms? But he was given a huge opening with the panic attack thing. It was something very emotional. That guy was testing us. He's like, here's something that's really important to me, and I want to see if you get where I'm coming from. And so you need to salute and kind of support those emotional things by responding to them. That was the next question to ask, was the panic attack question, and then to loop back and get everything else later as it goes. just I think quickly here to say that all the complexity of the field work can put this happens, I think hopefully for you sometimes, this flow state. And I think about the jump to hyperspace from Star Wars where we're going fast but we're going slow. It's almost this weird out-of-body moment for me when an interview is really kind of jumping around and kind of creatively stimulating. Suddenly everything slows down for me and I have all the space, and this is kind of a flow state. If you ever get to that point, you just sort of remember this and kind of enjoy it. Here's a thing I think that can help us improve as a field. If you go to that URL, there's about 55 different war stories from people, including the story from Dan here about how he kneeled in cat pee, and it's really a great story. These are not about, when this happens, do that. They're not tips and tricks. They're just the stories of the real unusual and sort of wonderful messiness that happens from this process. And I encourage you to read these. If you have others, I'm always collecting more contextual research war stories. But that's, sort of a thing I'll leave you with to kind of go off and learn more. And with that, in whatever time, Yasmina, we have to keep talking, I'd love to see what questions have come up and hear from people.
Excellent presentation, Steve. Lots of questions have come in. All righty, folks, we're going to take them in the order they came in. And we are going to start with, let's see here, Elizabeth's question. She asks, how do you determine how many users you should interview? I know how many I need for usability testing, but how many for this type of research?
That's a good question, and I think the anthropology answer to that is to keep going until you hear repeated information. Which is that's all nice and good, but we have to scope these things. It depends on things like, are we going to cover different markets or different user groups? I'll just say typically we look at, like a reasonable size study is kind of like 16 to 20 people. And, again, it depends on what are the characteristics that we're looking across or what are the things we're trying to cover. I will say that like at 6 is this sort of bare minimum. 8 is usually where I start to get a sense of like, oh, okay, now I know what's going on. But if I'm doing 8 and I'm splitting it across 2 teams, then the researchers themselves aren't kind of given enough time in the field to have those aha moments where they start to convert into really understanding. 25 starts to be a lot of data. It starts to be impossible to kind of manage. And so when there's a push to get higher numbers, that's when I try to create multiple phases where we'll do one phase of 12 and then we'll do something with it, and then the second phase of 12 will be an iteration of it. So those are kind of my rules of thumb around that.
Great, thank you. Rick would like to know, please comment on etiquette and techniques when introducing and setting up your recording devices. I have seen a lot of people put more focus on their cameras/recorders than on the person they are recording. Yeah,
the word etiquette is such a great word. I think that's really well put. The good thing we have going now is that these devices are small. Video cameras, I have a tabletop tripod that I use, and if I'm using an audio recorder, it's teeny. Actually don't. A lot of people want to use their iPods for everything, or their iPhones. iPhones for everything. I think, to me, I have battery life and storage concerns. I'd rather have a dedicated device. And I think the etiquette can kind of work for you in that part of what you're trying to do is present yourself as legitimate. And so coming in, there's a time when we'll set up, we'll arrange where we're going to sit. We'll sort of, determine what seats people are in and where the lighting is. We have forms that are consent forms or NDAs or whatever that is, and as part of that, that's when I'll do my setting up. So I'm not starting the interview. I give them a task. I start setting up my things. The form, they've been recruited knowing that we're going to record. They sign a consent form that says they're going to record, and then we set it up, and I try to leave it. I, of course, have to monitor the battery and make sure we're still recording and so on. And if there's 2 people, it's nice to assign one person to lead the interview and another person to monitor the devices, because it is really distracting. It takes away my focus on the person. So I think also people aren't freaked out by these devices as much as you might think that they would be. So to kind of keep them off to the side, keep them kind of unobtrusive. We're not clipping microphones onto people. I think that's sort of our approach to the etiquette.
Thank you. Rohit Tashwa would like to know, if my client has some market research data and other analytics data, should I base my questions we want answers to on these? I mean,
based on the little amount of information, I would say yes. It depends on sort of what's the overall objective and what do you know. But things that you have hypotheses about or suspicions about or information about, it's definitely going to inform your approach to the interview. You might have something that you've heard that you want to, you know the what, but you want to understand the why. So yeah, and I said methods work together. I think those kinds of data sources are ones that you can, if you can get access to them, they start to frame. They might just simply frame the research question. Well, we know these different things, so this is what we think we want to ask. So yeah, I like the way you put it.
Next question here from Jamie. Do you have any tactics for getting a constructive session from users that are frustrated, hostile, or unhappy with your product? There's too much focus on very specific problems.
Yeah, I'm nodding my head here in agreement. I've had, and probably based on your question you have as well, I've had some epic experiences with that where in one case we couldn't even get the first question out. And early on I learned a little lesson when my clients briefed me and they said, look, we've been hearing a lot about this problem here. We only have half an hour with them. Just don't talk about that at all. If they bring it up, tell them we know it and just move on to your questions. And it was totally unsuccessful. I sort of tried it once very naively. In a B2B setting or any setting where there's a relationship to the product and we represent that product, they need to tell us. They've got to get it off. We don't have any rapport with them if we're not going to start off by listening to them. And listening means kind of getting what's on their mind. And, it depends on the situation. If you can say, hey, we've only got about half an hour, and I know from Jerome that you have some concerns about this. Would it be all right if we just focus on this other topic today, and Jerome's going to follow up with you in person tomorrow? You can try that. These folks I talked with were just pretty testosterone-driven kind of guys, let's just say that, and they weren't going to talk about anything else until they talked about it. And that becomes data. It's not necessarily the data we thought we wanted, but it becomes pretty important. So setting up the whole experience with, how they're recruited, what you're going to do in the interview, who's involved, what the follow-up is, make sure you give them the opportunity to be heard. And if that means kind of doing more things so that you can focus on your thing, that may be kind of a strategy. But I think the key is not thinking about it in terms of the actual interview itself, but as the whole exchange that you have with them.
Thank you. A couple folks asking, now that the interview is done, how do you consolidate the data? How do you package it and present it?
And that's a whole talk unto itself. And some of that's on SlideShare. So if you just Google my name and the phrase, we've done all this research, now what? You'll find, I think, a couple different presentations, some of which have audio with them that I think would be if we had 3 hours today, we would go through that one as well. So that's kind of where I'll point you for that.
Thank you. Let's see here. Brian would like to know. He says, I understand that talking and watching users are important, but more important is getting the right users. How do you approach who to interview for a project?
I talked about that, I think, at a high level when I talked about kind of creating a contrast. I think part of that's really figuring out, what's the problem here, and really brainstorming, well, who are the people that are going to give us insight about that? We also have to think about who can we get. I think more tactically, talking about behavioral characteristics rather than attitudinal characteristics is important. So saying things like, "Oh, we want to find people that are hip," is like, I don't know what to do with that. We want to find people who patronize a certain kind of retail outlet, like, I don't know, Sephora. I don't know if that's hip or not, but we want to find people that are, we can hypothesize ourselves that the characteristics we're looking for, or we might find that in someone who shops regularly at Sephora. And I pick that because that's something we can go and ask and be very clear that it's an objective criteria. So to kind of brainstorm and translate what we're thinking about into objective criteria, people that are, you tend to want to find people that really have something to say. So you're looking for lead users, people that, if this is about, tweeting, people that have 2 profiles and, schedule tweets and tweet, more than 40 times a day. That's kind of a user that's going to have a perspective on how, Twitter and social media is in their lives. Someone who has a Twitter account, but just, I use it sometimes, may not be able to give you as much. Even though you want to design for that person, you might want to skew towards where you're going to get some meat, where they have something to say. So those are some of the kind of things that we get at. There's no algorithm. I think it's really the conversation and part of the planning process to explore what that might be.
Thank you. And folks, we are over the top of the hour, so we're just going to take one more question here from Shirley. You mentioned 90 minutes a couple of times. Is there a recommended length of interview, which I guess can be in-depth but not exhausting?
Yeah, I did kind of default to that 90 minutes piece. I'm not sure why. To me, 90 minutes to 2 hours is what I try to get. An hour interview is really short. It seems long when you sort of plan it out, but you realize you're just getting into things. I had this experience a few months ago with someone who was very loquacious and just, told me stories constantly. But and so we had a lot of dialogue. I think in the first 10 minutes I didn't say anything besides the first question. So they really were willing to share. We were getting incredibly personal stuff about family illnesses and bankruptcy. So there was a lot of there. But at an hour and 15 minutes, I had this little light bulb go off where suddenly we were getting things from her. We were getting to what we were there to understand. And I was just sort of had this moment of astonishment. I've been doing this a long time. I'm pretty good at it. We had this loquacious person that was really sharing, and it took 75 minutes before, the nut was cracked. And thank goodness we had 2 hours. Thank goodness we didn't leave after 30 minutes or 60 minutes. We just wouldn't have gotten it. And so, I try to get, this becomes sometimes a scoping issue, but, 90 minutes to 2 hours. If it's a B2B thing, you may not be able to get that. To try to get somewhere between 30 and 60 and kind of support that with multiple people is better. But, I guess and more than 2 hours, I think definitely that's the point at which I think it starts to become exhausting. And sometimes people tell me, oh, well, if the person's willing to keep going, I'm going to keep going. But I think we have a lot of power to push people to keep going, and I'd rather respect the original agreement and try to stop at that 2 hours. So that's kind of my take on length.
Thank you very much, Steve. And with that, folks, we're going to say a really big thank you to Steve for his presentation today and for sharing all his knowledge and expertise with us. Steve, is there anything additional you'd like to leave the audience with as we close the program?
I just, thank people for the questions. I'm sure we didn't get to all of them. There's Twitter and other kinds of things, so I look forward to continuing the dialogue. And thanks for the opportunity to speak with you.
Folks that attended our event today, we thank you for attending and hope you benefited from it. Lots of great comments coming in the group chat now. Everyone's saying, thank you, Steve. Awesome presentation. So we'll take that as a yes. Folks that did send in your questions, thank you for those because those really do add so much to our events, and we're sorry we were not able to get to all of them. We will push out Steve's Twitter handle to you in the group chat so you can follow up with him on Twitter. As well, a couple of you have posted the URL to the SlideShare presentation that Steve mentioned, so we hope you take a look at that. And finally, we want to let you know that we did push out in the group chat, so if you didn't open it, please do. There's a code in there to save you some money today on Steve's book. Steve's book is the O'Reilly Deal of the Day, Interviewing Users. You can visit O'Reilly.com, look on the right-hand side. You can't miss it. It's right there. And it's available today at an excellent price as a thank you for all of you for attending our event today. So if you like what you heard today, please, we encourage you to take advantage of that good price and get the book, and it will really help you with your day-to-day. Again, thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude today's webcast. Goodbye, everybody.